Mr. President, we have discovered, the federal prosecutors have discovered that for the last 5 years, there has been massive welfare fraud in the great state of Minnesota. Massive. Over $1 billion of American taxpayer money has been stolen. But there's more. They came up with a third scheme. This one makes you want to throw up in a potted plant. This one's centered around autistic children. A group of providers, supposedly medical providers, got together and they went to the welfare authorities in Minnesota and said, we need money to help autistic children. You say, well, that's a wonderful thing to do. They went out and started recruiting autistic children, but they couldn't find very many autistic children. So they started going to parents in the Somali community and saying, can we call your child autistic? Part of this $1 billion that was stolen, at least a portion of it, went to a terrorist organization in Somalia. Politicians in Minnesota let this happen.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to America First. If you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and smash that like button because we're bringing you the truth that the mainstream media won't tell you. Today we're going to talk about something that's going to make your blood boil, and I mean that literally. We're going to react to Senator John Kennedy's absolutely devastating floor speech about what's been happening in Minnesota. And folks, this is exactly why we need to put America first. So let's get right into it.
Mr. President, as you well know, the American people are the most generous people in the entire world. In our country, when you are hungry, we feed you. When you are homeless, we house you. When you're too poor to be sick, we'll pay for your doctor. We spend trillions of dollars a year helping our friends and neighbors who are less fortunate than we are. And that's rare in this world. I've been all over our wonderful world. You have too, Mr. President. And in many countries, if you get down on your luck, they'll let you die in a ditch. But not in America. Not in America. We take care of our fellow citizens. But it's expensive. We spend trillions of dollars a year to do this. And that money that we spend didn't just fall from heaven. We thank heaven for it, but it came out of taxpayers' pockets. And we shouldn't lose sight of that fact, Mr. President. Now, that's why I get so irritated. Irritated's the wrong word. Angry. When I find out that people take advantage of the American people's generosity. It makes me want to knee someone in the groin. It just makes me furious. And I think the American taxpayers feel the same way. What I'm about to tell you, Mr. President, let me apologize in advance, is deeply disgusting. It's deeply disgusting. I mean, it is clown world on steroids. And when I first read about this, Mr. President, I read it a second time because I experienced slap-jawed astonishment. And when I read it a second time and I realized it was true, I just wanted to run away screaming. What am I talking about? Mr. President, we have discovered, the federal prosecutors have discovered, that for the last 5 years, there has been massive welfare fraud in the great state of Minnesota. Massive. Over $1 billion of American taxpayer money has been stolen. Just stolen. They can call it fraud, but a better term would be stealing. And this fraud has been centered in the Somali community in Minnesota. Now, I'm not here to criticize the Somali community. I'm here simply to describe what happened. The Somali community in Minneapolis is about 80,000 people. They're centered around Minneapolis. And let me say it again. I'm not here to denigrate the Somali people or people of Somali ancestry just because of the actions of a few. But it is a fact that this $1 billion in welfare fraud occurred almost exclusively in the Somali community in Minnesota and was orchestrated by people with Somali ancestry. That's a fact. Facts aren't racist. Facts are facts. So far, 59 people have been convicted, 86 have been charged, and 78 of them are of Somali ancestry. That's just a fact. Now, what these criminals did they had 3 very elaborate schemes. The first scheme was centered on supposedly feeding hungry children in the Somali community. A group, a nonprofit run by some people with Somali ancestry. The name of the nonprofit was called Feeding Our Future. Feeding Our Future. Feeding Our Future went to the welfare authorities in the state of Minnesota, which of course was administering federal taxpayer money, and they said, "Look, Feeding Our Children said, Feeding Our Future said, we want to feed hungry children in the Somali community." And the welfare people in state government in Minnesota gave them the money to do that. It started out very small. But the idea was that Feeding the Future, the Somali nonprofit organization, would take this federal taxpayer money, American taxpayer money, and go to businesses, most of which were Somali businesses, in the Somali community and set up feeding sites where they supposedly would take children to get a hot meal. On paper, it sounded great. As I say, it started out very, very small, just a few $1 million. But eventually, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And more businesses in the Somali community signed up to be feeding sites. And Feeding Our Future, the Somali nonprofit, kept going back to the Social Services Department in Minnesota saying, "We need more money, we need more money." And at the height of the fraud, they were spending about $100 million a year. Not over the lifetime of the program, $100 million a year. There's just one problem. There were no hungry children. There were hungry children, They just weren't getting any of the money. And the businesses, many of which were Somali owned, which were getting some money to feed the children from Feeding Our Future, the nonprofit that was quarterbacking this whole thing, they weren't giving any of the money to hungry children. They were spending it. These businesses were spending it on yachts and vacations and jewelry and furniture for their home. That was scheme number one. But it got worse. The second scheme was supposedly to help people who are homeless. Remember, I said in America, when you're homeless, we'll house you. Well, that's what they were trying to do in Minnesota. A nonprofit was set up, again run by someone of Somali ancestry, and this nonprofit went to a bunch of providers who supposedly were going to provide housing. And they told the welfare authorities in Minnesota that they needed millions of dollars to house people who were homeless. And once again, the program started out small. When they started it in 2020, these crooks started it in 2020, they said, we only need $2.6 million. But then in 2021, they said we need $21 million. And in the following years, they said we need $42 million the next year, then $74 million to feed, or rather to house the homeless, then $104 million a year. Not the total scheme, a year. There's just one problem. None of the money was going for housing. None of the money was going to help people who were homeless. These providers and this nonprofit that was coordinating it just put the money in their pocket. But there's more. They came up with a third scheme. This one makes you want to throw up in a potted plant. This one's centered around autistic children. Once again, in this third program, a group of providers, supposedly medical providers, got together and they went to the welfare authorities in Minnesota and said, we need money to help autistic children. You say, well, that's a wonderful thing to do. And then these providers, once the welfare department at the state government in Minnesota gave them the okay, they went out and started recruiting autistic children. You say, well, okay, we have to get the word out somehow. But they couldn't find very many autistic children. So they started going to parents in the Somali community and saying, can we call your child autistic? Can we certify that your child is autistic? If you'll let us do that, we'll pay you a bribe. Anywhere from $400 to $1,500 a child. Now, once again, the program, it didn't start big. These were sophisticated crooks. And its leader was a woman by the name of Asha Farban Hassan. She was also in, by the way, on the feeding of the children scam as well. And as best we can tell, they approached parents only in the Somali community. But once again, they couldn't find enough autistic children, so they bribed the many parents in the community, gave them money to certify that their children were autistic. In the first year, they were clever. They only asked for $3 million. The second year, in 2019, they asked for $54 million. Then in 2020, they went up to $77 million. And then in 2021, they really got greedy. They went to $183 million. And in 22, $280 million. And in 2023, $400 million. All total, in these three fraud schemes, these crooks stole $1 billion of taxpayer money. Here's I started to say worst part, but let me amend it. Equally bad part. You say, well, hello, how could this happen? Why didn't the people in the Department of Social Services and the Welfare Department in state government, when they saw these claims arising, why didn't they say something? Didn't they go out and check these businesses that were supposedly sites to feed homeless children? Didn't they go talk to some of the children and their parents to see if some of the children really were autistic? Didn't the state authorities go out and say, can you show us one of the homes that you're providing to the homeless people? After all, we're spending $1 billion. They didn't, because the politicians wouldn't let them. And the crooks who were setting all this up, they're pretty smart. I'll give you one example. Remember I talked about the nonprofit involved in feeding the so-called hungry children, called Feeding the Future. The rank and file employees in the welfare office started getting suspicious when the claims went up, and they contacted Feeding Our Future. And they said, hey, what's going on here? You know, we're going to start cutting off these claims because it's getting a little bit expensive. And you know what Feeding Our Future did? They threatened the employees. They said, if you cut off our money, they sent them an email, and they did it by phone. They told the state agency that failing to promptly approve new applicants from minority-owned businesses would result in a lawsuit, feeding accusations of racism that would be sprawled across the news. Feeding Our Futures went to the state and said, if you stop giving us this money, we're going to call you racist and we're going to sue you. And you don't want to be in the news. Now, here's what, and you say, well, why didn't the employees do something? They did. They told the people higher up, the people with the flags in their office. And you know what they did? Nothing. You know why? Well, here's what the legislative auditor in Minnesota said. He said that the threat of litigation and the negative press affected how the state politicians use their regulatory power. And here's what a fraud investigator in the Attorney General's office said. She said, there is a perception that, I'm quoting now, that forcefully tackling this issue would cause political backlash from the Somali community, which is a core voting bloc for Democrats. And in fact, one of the other witnesses in the fraud investigation said, look, I told the prosecutors, let me just give you a cold dish of truth. The 80,000 voting block of folks with Somali ancestry, you got to have their votes to win in Minneapolis. And if you're a Democrat and you can't win Minneapolis, you can't win in the state. So the politicians did nothing. Don't just take my word for it. And don't blame the state employees. They tried. In fact, recently the state employees, they just said, look, we've had enough. They posted this. These are over several hundred employees from the Minnesota Department of Human Service who administer this program, who just get up every day and go to work and do their job and want to help people. This is what they posted on social media. I'm quoting now, Mr. President. Governor Tim Walz is 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota. I'm sure he wasn't the only one, because this fraud was an open secret. But I'm quoting from what the employee said. Governor Tim Walz is 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota. We let Tim Walz know of fraud early on. That's the employees talking. Hoping for a partnership and stopping fraud, but no, we got the opposite response. Tim Walz systematically retaliated against whistleblowers, using monitoring, using threats, using repression, and did his best to discredit fraud reports. Instead of partnership, we got the full weight of retaliation by Tim Walz and an indifferent mainstream media. It's scary, isolating, and left us wondering who we can return to. And now there are reports coming out, Mr. President. I don't know if they're true, but I know the prosecutors are desperately trying to get the bottom of it. And I don't want to say that this is true, but a report came out in a publication called City Journal, which is published by the Manhattan Institute. And they are alleging that money, part of this $1 billion that was stolen, they are alleging that at least a portion of it went to a terrorist organization in Somalia that we've all heard of. It's notorious. It's an organization called Al-Shabaab. They hate Americans. They're terrorists. They want to kill Americans and drink their blood out of a boot. They were taking a cut, according to this claim. Again, I don't know if it's true, but the prosecutors are trying to get to the bottom of it. Now, there's been a lot of allegations about racism in these reports. They're saying, oh, you're just picking on the Somali community. I'm not. And I don't think the American people are. I think what they're picking on are crooks. They're picking on crooks. Everything I just gave you are facts, Mr. President. It has nothing to do with race. But it is a fact that these $1 billion schemes were cooked up by leaders in the Somali community in Minneapolis and in Minnesota. And it is a fact that most of the businesses that participated in this fraud and this thievery were run by people of Somali ancestry. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad. That's just a fact. And I don't think we ought not to talk about it. And it is a fact that the kickbacks paid to parents to allow their children to be signed up as autistic, in order to get the federal taxpayer money, the parents were of Somali ancestry. It doesn't give me any pleasure to say that, but it is a fact. And it is a fact that the politicians, not the employees, the rank and file employees and the welfare offices, but the politicians in Minnesota let this happen. It is disgusting, Mr. President. Disgusting. We're trying to put together a budget right now. And we've got state officials in Minnesota, because they wanted votes, that are allowing people in their state who are crooks to steal $1 billion from the American taxpayer. Money that could have gone to people who really were homeless, and children who really were hungry, and kids who, through no fault of their own, really were autistic, instead of stolen, a portion of which allegedly was sent to a terrorist organization in Somalia. Man, these people ought to all be put in jail, including the politicians. Makes me want to stick my head in an oven.
Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana just delivered one of the most important speeches you'll hear all year on the Senate floor, and I want to walk through this with you because what he's exposing here is not just about fraud. It's about the complete and total betrayal of the American taxpayer. It's about politicians who care more about votes than they do about justice. And it's about a system that has been so corrupted by political correctness and identity politics that we can't even enforce our own laws anymore. Now, before I get into the details, let me say something that Senator Kennedy said, and I want to emphasize this because it's important. This is not about attacking any particular community based on their ethnicity or their heritage. This is about holding criminals accountable. This is about protecting American taxpayers. This is about the rule of law. When you steal from the American people, you need to face justice, period. I don't care what your background is, I don't care what community you come from, and I don't care what your skin color is. If you're a crook, you're a crook, and that's what we're talking about here. Senator Kennedy starts off by reminding us of something that I think we all need to hear more often. Americans are the most generous people on earth. And you know what? That's absolutely true. When people are hungry, we feed them. When people are homeless, we house them. When people can't afford health care, we help them. We spend trillions of dollars every single year taking care of our fellow citizens, and that's something we should be proud of. That's what makes America exceptional. We don't let people die in ditches like they do in other countries around the world. We take care of our own. But here's the thing, and this is what Senator Kennedy is getting at. That money doesn't fall from heaven. It comes from hardworking American taxpayers who get up every single day, go to work, pay their taxes, and trust that their government is going to use that money responsibly. They trust that when they pay into these programs, the money is actually going to help people who need it. So when someone steals that money, when someone takes advantage of American generosity, it's not just theft. It's a betrayal of trust. It's a slap in the face to every single person who works hard and plays by the rules. And that's exactly what happened in Minnesota. Over $1 billion, folks. Let me say that again. Over $1 billion of American taxpayer money was stolen through welfare fraud over the last 5 years. This isn't some small-time operation. This isn't somebody fudging their food stamp application. This was massive, organized, systematic fraud on a scale that's almost hard to comprehend. Senator Kennedy lays out 3 different schemes, and each one is more disgusting than the last. Let me walk you through them because you need to understand just how brazen these criminals were. The first scheme was centered around an organization called Feeding Our Future. Now, on paper, this sounds like a great thing, right? They told the Minnesota welfare authorities that they wanted to feed hungry children in the Somali community in Minneapolis. Who could be against that? So the state gave them federal taxpayer money to set up feeding sites at various businesses in the community. It started small, just a few $1 million, but it kept growing and growing. More businesses signed up to be feeding sites. Feeding Our Future kept going back to the state, saying they needed more money, more money, more money. And at the height of this fraud, they were spending $100 million a year. Not total, folks. $100 million per year. Here's the problem. There were no children being fed. I mean, sure, there were hungry children in the community. I'm sure there were kids who could have used a hot meal. But they weren't getting any of that money. The businesses that were supposed to be feeding these kids were just pocketing the cash. They were buying yachts, taking vacations, buying jewelry, furniture, living high on the hog while claiming they were feeding hungry children. That's not just fraud. That's evil. That's taking money that was supposed to go to vulnerable kids and spending it on luxury items for yourself. But wait, it gets worse. The second scheme was about housing the homeless. Another nonprofit, again run by someone in the Somali community, went to the Minnesota welfare authorities and said they needed money to house people who were homeless. The program started at $2.6 million in 2020. By 2021, they were asking for $21 million, then $42 million, then $74 million, then $104 million per year. And guess what? Just like the feeding program, none of that money was going to house anybody. These providers and this nonprofit were just putting the money straight into their pockets. Now, if those two schemes don't make you angry enough, let me tell you about the third one, because this one is absolutely sickening. This scheme targeted autistic children. Think about that for a second. These criminals looked at the most vulnerable members of our society, children with autism who need special care and treatment, and they saw a meal ticket. They saw dollar signs. Here's how it worked. A group of so-called medical providers went to Minnesota welfare authorities and said they needed money to help autistic children. Great idea, right? Except they couldn't find enough autistic children to justify the massive amounts of money they wanted. So what did they do? They started going to parents in the Somali community and bribing them. They offered parents anywhere from $400 to $1,500 per child to let them falsely certify their kids as autistic. Let that sink in. They were bribing parents to lie about their children having a disability so they could steal money from programs designed to help kids who actually have autism. And just like the other schemes, it started small. $3 million in the first year, then $54 million in 2019, $77 million in 2020, $183 million in 2021, $280 million in 2022. And by 2023, they were stealing $400 million in just this one scheme alone. The mastermind behind this particular operation was a woman named Asha Farhan Hassan, and according to Senator Kennedy, she was also involved in the fake child feeding program. These people were running multiple fraud operations simultaneously, stealing from multiple programs at the same time, and getting away with it for years. Now, you're probably asking yourself the same question I asked when I first heard about this. How in the world did this happen? How did nobody catch this? We're talking about $1 billion over 5 years. Didn't anybody in the Minnesota state government notice that these claims were skyrocketing? Didn't anybody think to go out and actually check if these feeding sites existed? Didn't anybody think to verify that these children were actually autistic? Didn't anybody think to go look at the housing that was supposedly being provided to homeless people? And here's where this story goes from infuriating to absolutely enraging. The rank and file employees at the Minnesota Department of Human Services did notice. They did get suspicious. They did try to do something about it. But they were stopped. They were stopped by the politicians. Senator Kennedy explains that when state welfare employees started asking questions and tried to cut off funding to Feeding Our Future because the claims were getting suspicious, the organization threatened them. They sent emails and made phone calls saying that if the state cut off their money, they would file a lawsuit accusing the state of racism. They said the accusations would be sprawled across the news. They weaponized identity politics and the fear of being called racist to keep the money flowing. And it worked. The employees reported this up the chain to the politicians, the people with the flags in their offices, as Senator Kennedy put it, and those politicians did absolutely nothing. Why? Because they were afraid. They were afraid of the political backlash. They were afraid of losing votes. Don't take my word for it. Senator Kennedy cites the Minnesota legislative auditor who said that the threat of litigation and negative press affected how state politicians use their regulatory power. A fraud investigator in the Attorney General's office said there's a perception that forcefully tackling this issue would cause political backlash from the Somali community, which is a core voting bloc for Democrats. Another witness in the fraud investigation said, and I quote, "The 80,000 voting bloc of folks with Somali ancestry, you got to have their votes to win in Minneapolis. And if you're a Democrat and you can't win Minneapolis, you can't win the state." So let me make sure I understand this correctly. Politicians in Minnesota knew that massive fraud was taking place. They knew that $1 billion of American taxpayer money was being stolen. They knew that programs designed to help hungry children, homeless people, and autistic kids were being abused. And they did nothing because they were worried about losing votes. They sacrificed justice and the rule of law on the altar of political expediency. This is exactly what's wrong with our country right now. This is what happens when we allow identity politics to override common sense and basic law enforcement. This is what happens when politicians care more about getting reelected than they care about doing what's right. And this is why we need leaders like Senator John Kennedy, who have the courage to stand up and tell the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. The state employees who tried to blow the whistle on this fraud were retaliated against. Hundreds of employees from the Minnesota Department of Human Services, people who just get up every day and try to do their jobs and help people, posted on social media, calling out Governor Tim Walz. They said, and I'm quoting here, "Governor Tim Walz is 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota. We let Tim Walz know of fraud early on hoping for a partnership in stopping fraud. But no, we got the opposite response. Tim Walz systematically retaliated against whistleblowers using monitoring, using threats, using repression, and did his best to discredit fraud reports. These are the people on the ground who were trying to protect your tax dollars, and they were punished for it. They were threatened, monitored, and silenced by their own government because their government cared more about politics than justice. Now, if all of that wasn't bad enough, there are reports coming out, and Senator Kennedy is careful to say that he doesn't know if this is verified yet, but prosecutors are investigating claims that some of this stolen money, some of this $1 billion that was taken from American taxpayers, ended up going to a terrorist organization in Somalia called Al-Shabaab. For those who don't know, Al-Shabaab is a notorious terrorist group that hates Americans and has carried out attacks against American interests. Senator Kennedy describes them as people who want to kill Americans and drink their blood out of a boot. And according to reports from the City Journal published by the Manhattan Institute, they may have been getting a cut of this fraud money. Let me be clear about something. If that turns out to be true, if American tax dollars that were supposed to feed hungry children and house homeless people and help autistic kids ended up funding terrorists who want to kill Americans, then everyone involved in this fraud needs to spend the rest of their lives in prison. And that includes the politicians who enabled it by refusing to investigate and by retaliating against whistleblowers. Now, I want to address something that Senator Kennedy addresses in his speech, because I know there are going to be people who say we're being racist by talking about this. Senator Kennedy makes it very clear, and I want to echo this, that this is not about attacking the Somali community as a whole. The vast majority of Somali Americans are law-abiding people who came to this country for a better life and who contribute to their communities. Nobody is saying otherwise. But it is a fact that these specific fraud schemes were organized by people in the Somali community in Minneapolis. It is a fact that 78 out of the 86 people charged in this case are of Somali ancestry. It is a fact that the businesses that participated in the fraud were largely Somali-owned. It is a fact that the parents who were bribed to falsely certify their children as autistic were from the Somali community. These are facts, and facts are not racist. Senator Kennedy says it perfectly. He's not picking on a community. He's picking on crooks. When you commit fraud, when you steal from American taxpayers, you need to be held accountable regardless of your background. The rule of law has to apply equally to everyone, and if we can't have that conversation, if we can't prosecute criminals because we're worried about being called racist, then we don't have a justice system anymore. We have a system where some people are above the law based on their identity, and that's the exact opposite of what America is supposed to be about. This is why Senator Kennedy's courage in giving this speech is so important. He knew he was going to be attacked for this. He knew people were going to accuse him of racism and bigotry. He knew the mainstream media was going to try to twist his words. But he said it anyway because it needed to be said. The American people deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know that their tax dollars are being stolen. They deserve to know that politicians are putting their own political interests ahead of justice. And they deserve to know that when whistleblowers try to do the right thing, they're being punished for it. This is a perfect example of everything that's wrong with the modern Democratic Party. They talk a big game about helping the poor and the vulnerable, but when their programs are being abused and money is being stolen from the people who actually need it, they don't care because they're too worried about losing votes. They talk about transparency and accountability, but when their own employees try to blow the whistle on fraud, they retaliate against them. They accuse everyone else of corruption, but they enable a billion-dollar fraud scheme because they don't want to be called racist. And let's talk about Tim Walz for a minute. This is the same Tim Walz who was Kamala Harris's running mate in the 2024 election. This is the guy who was auditioning to be one heartbeat away from the presidency. And according to his own state employees, he was systematically covering up massive fraud and retaliating against whistleblowers. The American people deserve to know about this. They deserve to know about it before the election, but the mainstream media wasn't interested in covering it because it didn't fit their narrative. This story is also a perfect example of why we need to be very careful about how we administer welfare programs. Now, before anyone tries to twist my words, I'm not saying we shouldn't help people who need it. As Senator Kennedy points out, helping our fellow citizens who are down on their luck is part of what makes America great. But we need accountability. We need oversight. We need to make sure that the money is actually going to the people it's supposed to help, not being stolen by criminals and potentially funneled to terrorists. We spend trillions of dollars on welfare programs in this country. That's money that comes from hardworking taxpayers. If we're going to spend that kind of money, we have an obligation to make sure it's being spent responsibly. And when we find fraud, we need to prosecute it aggressively, regardless of who's involved and regardless of the political consequences. Justice has to come before politics. So far, 59 people have been convicted in this case, and 86 have been charged. That's a start, but it's not enough. Every single person who participated in this fraud needs to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Every business owner who claimed to be feeding children while pocketing the money needs to go to jail. Every provider who falsely certified children as autistic needs to lose their license and go to jail. Every parent who took a bribe to lie about their child's medical condition needs to face consequences. And yes, the politicians who enabled this fraud, who ignored the warnings, who retaliated against whistleblowers, they need to face consequences too. Senator Kennedy ends his speech by saying that these people ought to be put in jail, including the politicians, and that it makes him want to stick his head in an oven. I understand that frustration. This is the kind of story that makes you lose faith in our institutions. It makes you wonder if anyone in government actually cares about doing the right thing anymore. But here's the thing. We can't give up. We can't let stories like this make us cynical and apathetic. We have to demand better. We have to demand accountability. We have to support leaders like Senator John Kennedy who have the courage to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. We have to vote out politicians who put their own political interests ahead of justice. And we have to stay informed about what's happening in our government so we can hold them accountable. This is why this channel exists. This is why we do what we do. The mainstream media isn't going to tell you these stories. They're not going to hold Democratic politicians accountable for enabling fraud. They're not going to report on whistleblowers being retaliated against when it makes their preferred candidates look bad. That's why we need independent voices who are willing to tell the truth. I want to thank Senator John Kennedy for having the courage to give this speech. He's exactly the kind of leader we need in Washington. He's not worried about being politically correct. He's not worried about offending people. He's worried about the truth, and he's worried about protecting American taxpayers. We need more people like him in government. And I want to say something to all of you watching. If this story makes you angry, good. It should make you angry. But don't just be angry. Do something about it. Share this video. Make sure people know what happened in Minnesota. Contact your representatives and demand accountability. Vote for candidates who will put American taxpayers first, not their own political interests. Get involved in your local government so you can make sure this kind of fraud isn't happening in your community. The American people are generous and compassionate, but we're not stupid, and we're not pushovers. When someone steals from us, when someone takes advantage of our generosity, we have every right to demand justice. We have every right to insist that our tax dollars are being spent responsibly. And we have every right to expect that our government will enforce the law equally for everyone, regardless of their background or their political connections. $1 billion. That's how much was stolen from American taxpayers in Minnesota over just 5 years. Think about what that money could have done if it had actually been used for its intended purpose. Think about how many children could have been fed. Think about how many homeless people could have been housed. Think about how many autistic children could have received the care and treatment they needed. Instead, that money went to buy yachts and jewelry and vacations for criminals. And potentially, some of it went to fund terrorists who want to kill Americans. This is unacceptable. This cannot stand. We need to demand a full investigation into how this happened. We need to demand that everyone involved is prosecuted. We need to demand that the politicians who enabled this fraud and retaliated against whistleblowers are held accountable. And we need to make sure that reforms are put in place so that something like this can never happen again. Senator Kennedy is right when he says this is clown world on steroids. It's disgusting. It's infuriating. And it's exactly why we need to put America first. We need to put American taxpayers first. We need to put the rule of law first. We need to put truth and accountability first. And we need to stop letting politicians sacrifice justice on the altar of political correctness and identity politics. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. This is exactly the kind of content we're going to continue bringing you on this channel. Real stories, real facts, real accountability. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our future videos. Hit that like button to help us get this story out to more people. Share this video with everyone you know because the mainstream media isn't going to cover this the way it deserves to be covered. And let me know in the comments what you think about this story. Do you think Governor Tim Walz should face consequences for his role in enabling this fraud? Do you think the politicians who put their own re-election ahead of justice should be held accountable? Do you think we need major reforms in how we administer welfare programs to prevent fraud like this? I want to hear from you. This is America First, and we're going to keep fighting for the truth. We're going to keep holding corrupt politicians accountable. And we're going to keep putting American taxpayers first. Thank you for watching. God bless you, and God bless America.